Hello, everyone, for who is welcoming us or who is joining us today. So this is one of the final sessions that is running this week, I suppose, alongside DEPR's Public Sector Innovation Week. So I'd like to welcome you all on this Friday afternoon, and I'm hoping that the webinar fatigue isn't too bad, but there's lots and lots of interesting things that you're going to hear about today. So welcome. So this session is on scaling innovation. And we are going to be drawing insights and highlighting projects from across the Dublin region. Slide, please. So my name is Yvonne Pearce, and I sit on the Smart Dublin regional team. And we work across the 4 Dublin local authorities. We work with the Smart Cities reps and a wider network. We help convene people, we help initiate ideas and stimulate projects. We also support on kind of collaborative regional projects, and then our role is also to come and share what we're learning and engage with the wider network. So that's kind of why we're here today. One of our main collaborators, one of our main partners is Fingal County Council, and they are actually hosting us here today. So I just want to give a shout out to them, to Lisa, who's working behind the scenes, and Aisling and Dominic, who are such great partners throughout. So thank you very much. Slide, please. Okay, so the inspiration for this session today is the innovation framework that has been developed by the Department for Public Expenditure and Reform, and it is available on their website, our public service, alongside all sorts of other great resources. So you've got tips and tools and guidance, everything that you will need to know, certainly to get started in terms of, carrying out innovative projects, considering them, and thinking about how to embed innovation in your wider organisation. So as a little bit of homework from this webinar, I would encourage you to go onto that website, have a look, browse through and make a note to kind of refer back to it whenever you're thinking about project design and how to really engage with the idea of innovation. So that's there for you. Next slide, please, Lisa. So as part of that, outlined in that framework, there's a number of priorities that really are kind of areas for you to think about from the point of view of innovating, and certainly when we're thinking about scaling innovation. So the first priority is around citizen-centric innovation. So the goal of all of this is to deliver world-class public services. So naturally, we need to make sure that the citizens and public remain central to our innovative projects. So in terms of why we're innovating, how we're innovating, the public really needs to remain at the centre. So that is one of the first priorities as outlined in the framework. The second priority is around building a culture of innovation. So this is obviously both kind of within your program or your project team, but also within the wider organisation. So how do you equip your staff with the tools, the skills, the knowledge that they're actually going to need? How are you actually going to empower them, give them a mandate to actually work on innovative projects and to engage in this idea of continuous improvement? So that's an important priority as outlined in the framework. That leads us on to our third priority. Lisa, slide please. Thank you. Which is what we're focusing on today, this idea of scaling up innovation. So there's a couple of key features or key themes within that, and we're going to unpick that quite a bit today. But really, it's around connections, collaboration, co-design. So how do you actually build an ecosystem? How do you build a network to actually scale your successful innovations? And I know that's kind of a challenge that most people are facing. So I'm really happy that we're going to look at that a little bit more today. And obviously part of scaling is sharing what you're learning, which obviously is kind of why we're here. So we're going to look into that in greater depth. The fourth priority, which we might touch on a little bit today, but is this idea of transformative innovation. So as innovative projects are happening across the sector, as we're sharing them, as we're scaling them, this kind of builds this groundswell of innovation and makes it easier to, I suppose, create a mandate for innovation. So a strategic mandate, a policy mandate for innovation, and that is obviously kind of the gold standard and what we're aiming for. So that's kind of set the scene a little bit in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. Got 3 great speakers, 3 great projects. The first person that you're going to be hearing from is Alan Murphy, and he is the Smart Dublin Regional Manager, so he sits on the team that I sit on. He's going to be talking about a project that he's worked on called about mobility as a service, or MaaS. So I'll welcome Alan in a minute or two. And that's really looking at kind of the future of mobility in our towns and our cities. Really, really, really interesting, and I'm sure many of you are thinking about it. Our second speaker is Barry Rogers, and he's our Smart Tourism Programme Manager. Smart Tourism is also a regional initiative, and it's really, really lots of really interesting things happening in tourism. And one of them is his Digital Trails Toolkit, which is the project that he'll be presenting on today. Finally, we're going to have Payal Pandya, and she is on the Dublin City Council Smart Cities team. She's a business analyst, and she is working on a project around ring buoys. And there's a couple of interesting aspects to that project. One is the pilot itself, but also the fact that it led to this kind of innovative procurement framework. So you're really going to kind of hear about kind of scaling projects in action. One last thing I'll say before we start is there is a Q&A function on Teams. So it's the little speech bubble with a question mark in it. So if you have any questions, I would encourage you to put them in there throughout. We'll have time for some Q&A at the end. Hopefully we'll get to some of those. And if we don't, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Okay, Alan, over to you.
Okay, many thanks, Yvonne, and good afternoon, everybody. Over the next 15 minutes or so, Yvonne, I think that's what we have. I'm going to talk about a significant project we've been working on in Smart Dublin called Mobility as a Service. Sometimes a picture paints 1,000 words, and the diagram you're seeing here is trying to articulate, well, what is MaaS all about? So you see a person, you see an interaction with some user experience. Let's say it's a smartphone, and it's consuming services. So it's a bringing together of services, in this case, a variety of mobility services under one banner, under one package. There's a key word on that smartphone, which is pay. So this is far more beyond journey planning, which I think we're all familiar with in terms of trying to get from A to B. This introduces a payment aspect in terms of this mobility service. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the topic. Lisa, next slide, please. So the overview of my presentation, going to give you a background and explore more, well, what is MaaS? What's happening internationally? A summary of our activities to date in Ireland. And then I'm going to talk about the primary deliverable that we're about to publish, hopefully this month, which is our MaaS for Ireland report, which includes the case for change. So why is MaaS a good initiative for Ireland to embrace? Talk to you a little bit about the target operating model, or the proposed model for Ireland, and then key next steps. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so what is MaaS? And there's many definitions out there. If you're to do a quick Google on MaaS after this session, you're going to see a whole variety of definitions. But here's one take on it. To use an IT analogy, the hardware integration of transport services is already happening. So what do I mean by hardware? It's trains, it's buses, it's bikes, it's cars, things that we can touch, feel, and experience. So and mobility is transforming massively, especially with the whole climate change agenda, the switch to EVs, for example, the uptick in bike sharing schemes in Dublin, as well as in Western Europe in particular. Think of MaaS as the digital/software layer on top of hardware. So any good interaction of a computer system, you need good hardware and you need good software. So that's one way to articulate how MaaS is going to be the conduit or the digital experience on top of existing hardware, as well as new hardware. So mobility is going to change over the next 10, 20 years. New modes of transport that we haven't even thought about are coming down the line. The little diagram there is an infographic of a mobility hub. And we're starting to see more and more of these happening in Western Europe, where there's locations set up in cities where the hardware elements, so the bus, the bike sharing scheme, the electric vehicle, maybe it's a car sharing scheme, a cargo bike, are truly interacting in a seamless way. So what MAS tries to do is introduce that digital layer on top of that integration that we see already happening. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of an app experience? So MAS started off in Helsinki, the concept probably about 6-7 years ago. What you're seeing here is an infographic of a MAS offering in Helsinki, which is a bundle offering to try and describe it simply. You'll see bundles according to using certain modes of transport at the weekend. There's an unlimited bundle there. There's a pay-as-you-go bundle. But the principle of this is it's under one user experience, bringing together public transport as well as private transport operators under some price point and packaged up in a nice way for the user. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, moving on to Berlin. Other cities are now embracing or trialing this MAS concept. So here you have an example where the Public Transport Authority in Berlin took the lead to create an experience for Berlin residents. So using their weight, so the public transport operator, they brought in other shared mobility options into their own MAS offering. Next slide, please, Lisa. Moving on to Vienna. Here we have, again, a similar initiative where the local public transport authority developed a technology offering, an app for their citizens. The price point here on this one, actually, which is a kind of an all-you-can-eat mobility, was 365 euros for the year. So you would sign up for this service, for this bundle. So that's €1 per day to use unlimited modes of transport, which is a pretty compelling offering. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, there's huge inspiration coming from other domains. So we're talking about aggregation, but then we're also talking about a marketplace. So it's not too much of a leap to think of MAS as the Netflix of mobility or the Spotify of mobility, whereas a subscription-based model, Just Eat, is a local offering here as well in the food business. But perhaps there's something a bit more fundamental that we should look at. Should MAS be more of a marketplace, a la Amazon, eBay, Etsy? So our learning curve in getting our head around, well, what is MAS and what's happening in other cities, has been looking at aggregation models and the concept of marketplaces. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to what MAS is, and I hope you get a feel for the kind of user experience that we want to create here in Ireland. In terms of activities to date, a quick summary of where we started and where we are now. So back in 2019, it seems like an age ago, we got a couple of green lights, one from a meeting I had with the chief executives of Dublin City Council and the NTA. We were seeing a lot of activity around MAS as part of our smart city network. There was something there as a topic to explore locally. So we got the blessing from those chief executives to go off and do this. Big shout out to Deeper. We got awarded some funds as part of the public sector innovation fund. We did a couple of city visits to Helsinki and Berlin, and then we produced some initial thoughts via a point of view paper on where we think MAS is going. I think it's fair to say it was very app focused, and we were distracted a little bit by the kind of apps that I've just shown you that are happening elsewhere. But there was definitely a sense of there's a need for the public authority to lead, to step up here, to provide that kind of oversight, to make sure that MAS delivers on the expected social goals that we expect it to deliver. So then we started to dig a bit deeper. We arranged a workshop locally. We brought in, I think there was some 35 odd people, diverse stakeholders in a room just before COVID hit. And we got some great feedback from those stakeholders and a real energy from the stakeholders that they really want MAS to happen in Ireland. But a key outcome of that workshop was this is not just a Dublin thing. This is a national initiative, and Ireland is small enough to look at this nationally. Okay, so we need to do more work. Well, what does that mean? Our scope has now just increased beyond Dublin. So that's what's led us to producing our Mass for Ireland report, which I'm going to talk you through. The arrow at the bottom, I think, is really important to the topic we're talking about here in terms of scaling innovation. We've gone through a very steep learning curve. We've stepped up, we think, as Smart Dublin to facilitate the conversation around, bringing in diverse stakeholders into this conversation, really understanding what's in it for me, what's in it for you as a stakeholder, what does success look like for you, policy-wise as well as commercial-wise, if mass happens in Ireland. So all along, there's been this stakeholder buy-in during this process. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so let's talk about stakeholders and just call them out for a second. Well, when we did our initial stakeholder map as to who's potentially impacted by this, and I suppose back to the initial definitions I gave, this has the potential to disrupt the entire industry in Ireland. So who do we need to talk to? Who's possibly affected by this? Obviously, the National Transport Authority, obviously public transport operators, the private mobility operators that are up and running already in Dublin, as well as that want to come to Ireland. They want to see the right market conditions established for their operations. And look, they have a commercial agenda, and that's understandable. The councils play a role in terms of managing the public realm, but we want to see more modal shift towards sustainable modes of transport. How can the councils play a role to make that happen? There's other interested parties. Barry's going to talk about tourism in a second. Tourism, huge volumes of people pre-COVID were moving around Dublin. Can we encourage them to use more sustainable modes of transport? Transport Infrastructure Ireland, and we talked to other cities. This is just a handful. We did talk to other cities as well. And then we talked to some technology providers. What's the art of the possible? What can mass deliver? And then, of course, we're tapped into mobility networks like Polis and the International Transport Forum. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so in talking to all those stakeholders and understanding the local challenges we have, what's in it for each of the stakeholders that you see here on the screen? So let's talk about the guy in the middle, the planet. This is all about trying to shift people towards a more sustainable way of moving around, if you have to move around. And then up at the top, the end user, we're trying to provide an alternative to the private car. It's a hard sell. In Ireland, especially in Dublin, high dependency on the private car for many historical reasons. But the promise of the apps and the UX I described at the start is all about getting the right information to the right person at the right time. If you do that, you might be able to just switch the default of hopping in the car to get from A to B. For mobility providers, public transport can't be everywhere. We've just seen the NTA release the revised Greater Dublin Area strategy. Huge investment happening there, but it can't be everywhere. So they're looking to other mobility providers to solve that first and last mile solution to complement mass transit. On the private mobility operators, similar thing. Let's complement mass transit. Let's not cannibalize that. But of course, they see a commercial opportunity to increase their customer base. Department of Transport, mass will result in better data. Better data means you can measure effectiveness of policies that they want to introduce. The NTA, similar kind of oversight opportunity. And of course, if they want to do something themselves in terms of the TFI brand and next generation ticketing, that's possible as well as part of our model. The councils, again, back to the data point and working more collaboratively with the shared mobility operators they oversee. There's an opportunity there. And of course, other domains. What we're trying to do in our model is highlight and take that term mobility as a service to its nth degree. So to unlock a mobility service for other domains. So think a sporting event, a cultural event, that a mobility service from whatever provider it is could be tacked on to that concert, to that festival, to that match that's happening at the weekend. So really interesting to tease out that idea. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so again, as part of our learning curve, what we've seen with mass over the last 6 or 7 years and across different cities It's going away from just a pure app conversation to something far more fundamental, which is happening there. To use a term that's described here is level 4. Everybody likes levels in terms of methodologies. So this is one articulation of how mass is maturing. So we're talking now about societal goals and using mass to deliver societal goals, looking at policy that's coming from our Department of Transport around safety, accessibility, livability, creating a data network. So creating a network of private and public transport operators, and obviously rich functionality that the user will expect and also consume. So that's the level we're trying to deliver as part of our proposed model. Next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so in our report that's imminent to be published, we're just waiting on the blessing from the Department of Transport. The model we're proposing looks something like this. I suppose something to highlight here, that there's a lot of existing aspects that are already out there in the public realm that are just acknowledged on this diagram. So at the bottom, you have infrastructure. We already have parking bays, bus stops, roads, stations. Okay, that's nothing new. Transport production, same. We have buses and trains, etc. And well, scooters are going to be new, but look, that's pretty familiar. We have apps, the service provision level. We have those. People have smartphones. They're familiar with the concept of using apps to consume a service. And of course, we've got end users, and they're not homogenous. They're all diverse with different needs. What we're suggesting in our report is this new data and services hub in the middle to create a marketplace to capture relevant data and unlock services from the various mobility providers to then enable innovation at the service provision level according to user needs. Arrows are really important on diagrams like this, and this is an interactive, dynamic set of cogs that all need to work together. We came up with a set of design principles that you see there in the bottom right-hand side. So this model could have looked very different, and there are other cities doing it differently. But we felt that according to these design principles, this is the model that Ireland should go for. Just next slide, please, Lisa. So that the core of the model that we're suggesting is this new shared exchange. So a la an Amazon, a la an Etsy, a la an eBay marketplace with public oversight. And that marketplace brings in the relevant data sharing to report to public authorities as to the effectiveness of different operations, but also really importantly that the services coming from the various mobility providers are truly interoperable. If technically you can make those services interoperable, it fuels the conversation around innovation, which happens, next slide please, Lisa, which happens at the service provision level. So we envisage a market where there's multiple mass offerings, different kinds of bundles, different kinds of pricing points according to end user needs. So there is a world where we could have a national mass app, maybe a TFI branded app that's very doable in this model, but also something very hyper local. So think a university offering a mass service to its students. Think a business district doing the same. Think a large employer. We've got a lot of large employers in the Dublin region. Would they introduce a mass offering with the right price point, with the right set of services for their employees? Okay, next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so key next steps arising from our report. So, like I said, this has been going on since 2019, and we've had many conversations to inform the thinking in our report, but many bilaterals as well. And we're really, really delighted to see that the Department of Transport in their upcoming sustainable mobility policy, which is about to be published, are calling out mass needs to happen for the reasons I've articulated. They've also called it out in their 5 cities demand management study, and a second version of that is imminent. The NTA have called it out in the recent revision of the Greater Dublin Area Transport Strategy just released this week. They've acknowledged mass as part of their next generation ticketing project. we've got MAS onto the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment Regional Enterprise Plan to 2024. So that's been a huge achievement for us, is to just start the conversation and to see MAS getting called out in these strategic plans and projects. Also, we're very mindful of well, who does Smart Dublin work for? It's the councils. We're a local government organisation. So we're working with internal reps within the councils, looking at shared mobility operations. I mentioned scooters are coming. So we got to think the data that we need to get from scooter schemes. So that's already happening and getting us ready for the launch of those schemes. And of course, I talked about the public realm. There's huge competition for space, especially in Dublin city centre, and we want to promote shared mobility wherever possible. How can that happen? And then finally, to the mobility operators, both public and private, they know this is coming. Commercially, they're getting ready. And we're asking them also not to create walled gardens, which is to commercially confine themselves or tie them into situations that their services couldn't be unlocked to greater good. So there's been huge achievements already. Watch out for our report that we're going to publish very soon. So I think that's it from me, Yvonne.
Thank you, Alan. Incredibly interesting, inspiring. A couple of things I really liked about it. One is this idea of, the art of the possible, scaling ideas, not only thinking within our kind of country borders, but also looking to Berlin, Vienna, Helsinki, and then kind of having this, it's a very, very kind of creative process, and then funneling that down into something incredibly tangible. So I think that this project does that particularly well. We talked at the beginning about kind of pillar 3, scaling innovation, pillar 4, transformative innovation. And I think this is one of those projects that really is moving into that kind of transformative space. And finally, it's hopeful. It's bold and it's hopeful because, we're all hearing about the Climate Action Plan and COP26, and this is the type of project that will be transformative. So I'm very interested in it. I just would remind people that this is recorded, and there's a lot of that idea of MAS will straddle a lot of departments. So remember that you can share this afterwards with people who might be interested in this particular project. Okay, so next up, Barry Rogers. Barry, take it away.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. Thanks everyone for coming. So my name is Barry. I work on the Smart Tourism Programme for Dublin, which is a collaborative partnership between DCC and Fáilte Ireland. Usually when I give presentations, I have to do like a whistle stop tour of the 15 to 20 projects we do throughout the year. Today is different. I get to go like really deep on digital trails specifically, which is a big part of our program. So I'm delighted about that. So today I'm just going to talk about digital trails, specifically the toolkit that we developed for digital trail development with Fáilte Ireland as well. I'm going to talk about the process of developing the toolkit, and then I'm going to go into a lot of detail on best practice around developing digital trails specifically. So if you're interested, I think Frank is going to drop a copy of the document into the chat so that you can download it. But next slide, please, Lisa. Great. So first off the bat, well, what are digital trails? Why should you be interested in them? Digital trails are something that have become extremely popular. They were popular pre-COVID, and they've become even more popular since COVID-19. Part of this has been due to digital acceleration all around due to COVID-19. People are expecting when they arrive in destinations that these apps and these platforms will already exist. But effectively, all we're talking about here is digital storytelling on a huge shared scale in cities. And for us in our Smart Tourism Programme, we've decided to be leaders in this area specifically and define best practice, what we mean by best practice in digital trail development, and then share that with everyone in Ireland, all the local authorities. So next slide, please, Lisa. Thanks. So why should you be interested in digital trails? Well, digital trails, whether you know or not, are already happening all around you. If you work in a local authority, I can promise you someone in your authority is trying to develop a digital trail. If you work in the tourism industry, I guarantee you any action plans you have or strategies will have some kind of a digital app development strand to them. So digital trails are a huge pillar of that kind of work, but why should you be interested in kind of developing them? The first area is they can create a holistic tourism experience. They're really, really good for packaging up and developing one single kind of digital entity under one roof, be it heritage trails or gastronomic trails or whatever kind of story you want to tell. They're also really brilliant for visitor flow. So digital trails are one of the easiest ways you can create an experience from absolutely nothing. So you can use app development and platforms to build digital trail experiences in areas of your destination or your city where there might not be any existing tourism infrastructure already, and you can help divert visitor flow in that area. I know for us in Dublin, that's a huge priority at the moment. Sustainability is a huge one then. So specifically in areas where you might not be able to educate the visitor on a specific subject using traditional signage or kind of like invasive materials, using an app or using a digital trail can be a brilliant way of doing that. The fourth area then is new audiences. So it's something we should be thinking about a lot more in traditional tourism development is how can we include new audiences in everything we do, particularly in terms of the realm of accessibility. And designing digital trail platforms using the model that we've created is a brilliant way of doing that. And then share experiences. We obviously know all about social sharing, and then adding a revenue stream as well. Typically, we don't advise people to charge for digital trail platforms, but it is a great way of kind of adding another revenue stream to your tourism offering as well. Next slide, please, Lisa. So what's the context for all this? Why are we interested? Well, the first one is, as I just talked about, so digital acceleration. We want to be on top of all these trends. The second one is our Smart Tourism program, along with Docklands and DCC, is part of the development of probably the biggest mobile app development digital trail project at the moment in Dublin. So we wanted to understand all of our best practice around that and apply it to the development of that tender and that project. And then obviously we're always involved in European best practice as well, and bringing all that current thinking back to Dublin. And then finally, industry demand. One of the reasons we built this toolkit is because everyone was crying out for it. A lot of people were developing digital trails without knowing what the principles of best practice were. And so with ourselves in Fáilte Ireland, we decided that we were going to develop a toolkit which would educate kind of our tourism industry on the best practice in this area. Next slide, please, Lisa. So what's going on? What's the big problem? Like, why did we need to do this? Why did we need to sit down and form a group and spend 9 months writing a document? Well, there's a huge knowledge gap in this area, which is extremely important. People spend a lot of money on digital trails. It's a huge area of investment for local authorities, and we needed to kind of define exactly what was going on in this area. There's a lot of lack of known examples. There's very few examples of very good, popular digital trails in Ireland and in Europe. There's a very unclear path to development. If you are a local authority rep who has been asked to build a digital trail, I guarantee you it's very unclear how you actually get from 0 to 100 in terms of actually publishing it. No one knows who the suppliers are. It's very kind of unknown area of who you actually would approach if you wanted to do this. There's a lot of assumption-based development. And what I mean by that is identifying the bias of we need a digital trail and why. So that's one of the things we tried to undermine in our digital trail toolkit. We asked the hard questions of why you actually need a digital trail. So you don't go down the route of just building one for building one's sake. Finally, then there's a huge technical skills gap. One of the things we get across in our toolkit is that you don't need to be a programmer to build a digital trail. People think that you do. It's one of the barriers toward development. And then finally, there's a really unclear cost involved in digital trails, which is something we, again, focus on in our toolkit. So I'd encourage you to read through it. Next slide, please. So what was the process? What kind of road did we go down to build our digital trails toolkit? First thing we did was a gap analysis. We looked at what was unknown in the industry. We formed a group, which was really important throughout all of the local authority reps. This was really important because these were the people who were building digital trails. These were the people who would build them in the future. And then these were the people who would advocate for best practice going forward. Finally, then we had to understand our audience of who were the people we were doing this for. We decided it was going to be industry and local authorities, the practitioners who were going to be building digital trails. Then we went down a very long road of about 7 months of actually writing the toolkit. It went from 60 pages to 40 pages to 35 pages to 30 pages, which is kind of the finished document now. We went through lots of editing and approval. Then we eventually went to animation and publication. And then finally, we are now at the publication stage, which is why you can download it. And then next week, we've accompanied the publication with a step-by-step tutorial video to talk people through digital trail development as well, all the way through the toolkit. So a huge process which took us about 9 months. Now, you can go ahead, Lisa, thanks. So who did we collaborate with? Why, like, how did we do this? Really important players here, just to call some of them out. So you can see on the right the final document, the toolkit that we created. The people we built this with are why the toolkit ended up being so good. We formed a working group of all of the main people across all of the local authorities of Dublin who were best at building digital trails. We also brought in a lot of thinking from Europe, a lot of our colleagues in Europe who had built digital trails already on a huge scale. And then we had other people working for us as well who are practitioners in Ireland. We also had the likes of TU Dublin participate with us as well in terms of their best practice around digital innovation as well. So huge collaborative efforts. There was about 10 different people on the working group by the time we finished after 7 months. So it was a great collaboration. Next slide, please. So the toolkit itself is now published. You can download it. I would encourage everyone to do it. Please share it. Please send it to anyone you know who's already working on digital trails. It's a fantastic resource. And now I'm just going to go through some of the principles of digital trail development that we found and we baked into this toolkit. Next slide, please. So what are the steps? So just right off the bat, we defined in a similar way to Alan in his master report, the kind of principles of digital trail development that would mean that you would sidestep all of the kind of pitfalls of traditional development in this area. And just right off the bat, not to go into any big detail on all of them, because we do in the toolkit. The first area that kind of differentiates us in this toolkit is we actually try to dissuade most of the people who will read this toolkit from building digital trails. So we put together a very specific logic tree or decision tree at the start of the process, which makes sure that only the people who are really ready to build digital trails and can build the best digital trails do. And that's one of the biggest areas we tried to tackle, because what we were seeing was lots of people go down the road of building digital trails and then not finishing or spending too much money and then not getting to the publication stage. So the first step in our toolkit is actually to question the motives of the reader around why they want to build a digital trail and why they haven't gone down a more traditional route up until that point. So a really, really important process. And then we go through areas like clarifying your idea, developing content for your digital trail, which is huge, technical components as well, which I'll go into a bit later, and then selecting the right platform. And then finally, we talk about the software development lifecycle in a lot of detail as well. So I'll go into that briefly now in a moment. Next slide, please, Lisa. Great. So as I just said, we put a decision tree at the start of our toolkit, which is really important. Kind of talks people through why they should think about building digital trails. We asked them some really tough questions, and what this does is it undermines the bias of I've got 20 grand and I need to build a digital trail before the end of the year. And that's one of the kind of key areas we decided to go for. So we asked questions like, have you identified your audience? You know, is a digital trail really right for you and your destination? Have you thought of other traditional areas of doing this? Does it fit into your organization's strategy already? Does a digital trail fit into your brand? And do you have the IT framework capable of hosting it as well? So really tough questions. Next slide, please. Great. Now we also talk very specifically, we use the existing digital trail app lifecycle to provide kind of like a theoretical backing or like a practitioner's backing to our whole report. So this means that the toolkit itself isn't just our interpretation of what you should do in terms of best practice, but it actually follows a very specific logical step in terms of planning for your digital trail. We take you through how to analyze the market, how to choose your audience. We talk about design constantly in terms of building best practice in terms of UX design. We talk a lot about the importance of integration and testing. And finally, implementation and activation and maintenance. One of the things we were constantly saying throughout the development process, which got us through, was that digital trails are for life. They're not just for Christmas. So we're trying to enforce this idea that if you want to build a digital trail and spend 10 grand or €1 million on it, you need to be considering that this is a product. This is a tourism product like any other product, and it exists as part of a life cycle. and you need to consider each step of that life cycle from the start of the process. And that's one of the different things about our toolkit in terms of how robust it is. It really confronts you with these questions straight up. So next slide, please, Lisa. So first and foremost, what's your big idea? What is the thing you're trying to get across that you can't get across in any other way that you think a digital trail will fit? A lot of the time we see digital trails take the form of heritage trails, but they can absolutely be anything. The big idea is kind of the best part of the process in terms of coming up with your idea. Next slide, please. Then we talk about content development. The thing that makes or breaks digital trails is content development. A lot of people think it's the tech. A lot of people think it's augmented reality. It's absolutely not. Sometimes the best digital trails are the cheapest ones, which have just got the most creative content writers behind them. A lot of the time, some of the best digital trails I come across have been written by historical societies, in like Northern Scotland, because they just love the content of what they're building, and they put the best kind of thought into the content development. We have we have a whole chapter on content development in the toolkit, which will take everyone through exactly what they need to think about here. But ultimately, it's about creating the best content. And the structure and the success of the app kind of lives or dies on its content. Next slide, please. So finally, just very briefly on technology. So one of the biases that we were constantly coming across when we were looking at digital trail developments was that a lot of people thought it was an extremely expensive process. They thought they'd have to hire an app developer to build them a bespoke full stack app. And that was traditionally the case about 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Now the market has completely changed. Nowadays, you can build a digital trail using a platform-based model for as much as €50 a month. If you want to spend €100 a month, you can build a huge digital trail network for your destination. You can even, if you want to spend more, you can white label that digital trail platform and then brand it to your own destination. A lot of us are continuing to go down the bespoke route for a lot of different reasons, but that involves hiring a developer, content development agency to build a full stack product for you and your destination. It can be more expensive, but it can also be much more robust and you can have much more control over it. Those are the two main technology areas, but I'd just like to get across that anyone can build a digital trail, whether you have a very small budget or whether you have a big budget and you know how to code and be a developer as well. Next slide, please. Finally, activation. I'm just getting to the end of the presentation now. So one of the things we like to impress on people is how important activation is. This is how people come across your digital trail. In Waterford, they've got great examples where you stumble across QR codes on murals, and it encourages you to activate your trail. But we really try to impress on people that if you're spending a lot of money on this, you also need to be thinking about how people are going to discover and use your digital trail, be it in pre-trip planning or when they actually arrive at the destination as well. So we took a lot of inspiration from Waterford on this project, who are brilliant at activation as well. Next slide, please. And then finally, my last slide. One of the things we love to get across in this toolkit is understanding why some apps fail, understanding why this may have not worked in the past. So we like to always kind of drill this into the people who are reading this toolkit and get them to understand this right off the bat so that they can sidestep all these barriers before they actually go down the route of spending lots of money. Really important problems like, why don't people like to download apps? Things like visitors don't have enough space on the device to download apps using Wi-Fi or 3G. Content development, like content not being developed for a specific audience, really easy pitfalls that we'd like people to avoid. The app requests personal data or location data. Don't put barriers in front of your consumers if they're going to try and download technology. And then a really simple UX one finally, like the app freezes and crashes frequently. There we would tell people that they need to be investing in this kind of technology. They need to make sure that the technology is robust before they launch the app. And it gets back to our digital trails life cycle of testing, integration, maintenance before you actually launch it. So I think that's my final slide, Lisa. I would encourage everyone, if you have the time, please download the Digital Trails Toolkit. It goes into much more detail than I have today, and please share it with anyone who you know who might be developing these. If you have any questions, please come back to me. My email is on the left-hand side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry. Amazing, amazing. And I really, really like that idea of scale just isn't making something as big as possible, as quickly as possible, but it should be a robust and rigorous process to making sure that it is well thought out and it is appropriately applied. So I think that is like a big takeaway for me in terms of that presentation. So thank you. Okay, so quickly over to Payal. Payal, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yvonne. And I've been a part of Smart Dublin from quite some time now, and it still amazes me the kind of projects that are going on. And today I'm going to talk about the Smart Ring Boys project, or how it's officially called as the Ring Boy Theft Prevention Project. And now since I have time to talk about the project itself, I would like to answer three very basic questions that are there for any kind of project. That what is it, why are we doing this, and how are we going to do it? So if we move on to the next slide, Lisa. Thank you so much. So what is the project all about? So this project came into picture through a public consultation. That was the very start of it in 2019. People brought up that the ring boys are missing in some of the riverbeds. And that's how we came across the problem itself, that we started researching more on it, and we realized that this problem can be easily solved, especially in today's world where we are talking about technology. We are surrounded by the technologies. So the solution to this problem can be really easy and can be solved with a simple sensor by just having a look, just monitoring the ring boy, and this kind of reducing the time that it takes to replace those ring boys along the riverbed. So if I have to define the project itself in one sentence, it would be kind of an innovative approach to monitor the ring boys in real time with the use of sensors and trying to replace them as soon as possible. Now, this project is important and it's kind of special in many ways, and not just because of its innovative approach, but also the way that the different local authorities and different public bodies came together to make this project a possibility, and also the procurement framework that was designed for this project, because it's specifically targeted keeping in mind the scaling of the project in the future. So I would like to point that out, that this project was made possible because of the citizens, the Water Safety Ireland, the 4 local authorities within the Dublin region, and then there was the funding that was awarded for the procurement purposes and for the innovative solution itself. Now, if we move on to the next slide, I would like to answer that why are we even doing this? Why are we looking into this? Yes, there was a public consultation, but then we started looking into more of the details, the statistics around it. So if I take just even one region that is managed by the Dublin City Council along the River Liffey and the Docklands area, there are around 130 ring boys that are there around those areas, and approximately around 25 of those ring boys goes missing every week. Now just multiply it by, if I just want to look at for a month, it's around 100 ring boys that goes missing every month, and the time that it takes to replace those ring boys, it's around 2 to 4 weeks. And this includes kind of when we are kind of detecting that the ring boy is going missing, and then going through the whole process of putting up a new one. And I'm saying putting up a new one because it's not just the case of a misplacement, or that, oh, the ring boy is just lying down, we can put it up again, things like that. Because once the ring boy has been taken out of its casing, it cannot be used again. And that means it is ending up at some place in Ireland. And usually what happens is that these ring boys end up in trash as the plastic waste. So it creates kind of a sustainability issue, and I don't think I even need to tell that how plastic waste is a big problem in today's world. So along with the water safety issues that we have with the replacement of the ring boys, there are sustainability issues, and there are significant costs that are included in order to replace those ring boys. Now, if we move on to the next slide, the next question that I would like to answer is, how are we planning to do that? How did we even start with the solution? Now, we are surrounded by technology, as I mentioned, and we thought that For this purpose, a low-cost, low-pass sensors would just work fine to monitor these ring buoys. How are we going to do that was the next question. So we invited the tech companies within Ireland to propose their own solutions and to test these solutions in the real environment. And this was made possible with the two-phase multi-supplier procurement framework. And I would be talking about this framework itself in detail in the later slides, but I would like to point this out that this procurement framework made it possible for us to work across sectors and the organizations so that the companies have a safe space to experiment their solution. We were the first customers that they had, and also for the organization and the local bodies to come up together to co-create a solution that is, and in that way we can share our insights, share our knowledge, whatever the lessons learned, and we can share it across different local bodies to scale the innovation at a larger scale. Now, if you move on to the next slide. Thank you, Lisa. So I would like to bring your attention to the current process that we have with respect to the ring buoys itself. And if I have to check a ring buoy, if I'm the ring buoy inspector or the water safety officer, what I'll do is that I'll walk or drive to the location where all the ring buoys are. So suppose if there is one in my neighborhood, I'll start from there. I'll check the ring buoy, I'll check the rope if it is there, and if everything looks good, there is nothing missing, I'll just move on to the next location by walk or just by some vehicle driving through it. But if it is missing, then we would log that into a paper filing system. Then we would go to our office, order a new life buoy, wait for some time, and replace it during our next visit. Now we saw here a lot of opportunity to reduce this time to identify the missing ring buoy, and hence reducing the time to replace those, and thus also reducing the time to reducing the carbon emission and the waste production that is kind of a result of the whole process. So if you move on to the next slide, we see that if we deploy the sensors, we move from a more of a reactive approach to a proactive approach to the missing of these ring buoys. So what happens is if we deploy these sensors into the ring buoys, into the ring buoy casing itself, if any ring buoy is removed from its casing, we would get an alert through an email, through a text message, or even through a pop-up notification on an Android phone, and that notification would go to the relevant person. It could be the water safety officer, or it could be the ring buoy inspector. And then they can just go on to and order the new life buoys and replace it during their next visit whenever that happens. But these notifications would help them to give a specific location where the ring buoy is missing, and also the specific time that when it went missing. So that would kind of create a database that can be used again in the future to do a predictive analysis, or to see that which kind of ring buoys or which kind of locations are having more issues with these ring buoys getting vandalized and going missing, and what are the reasons behind it, and so on. So if we move to the next slide, we see that I mentioned that there are two-phased multi-supplier framework. So these 4 companies actually went through the phase 1, and the multi-supplier framework led them to test their solution in the 4 Dublin regions. So there were 4 companies: Civic, Reshore, Semicon, and CityTag, each one of having a different kind of sensor that they deployed. Some were weighted sensors, some were proximity sensors, and some were just a simple switch, and so on. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see that each of the companies picked one location, one local authority, and tested their solutions alongside the riverbed there. So it could be the seaside or the riverside. And they deployed around 25 sensors in each of these local authorities. And then the results were validated by the water safety officers. And they gave their feedback on the results. They saw that whether the sensors were working fine or not, what was the quality of the technology. It gave an opportunity to the companies to improve their technology and see how it is working in the real life environment. So it was a great opportunity for everyone to test the solution on both the sides, on the company side and on the local authorities side. If we move on to the next slide, we would see that there are these three things. There were web application, the mobile application, and the sensors. And these three things are from three different companies. And I'm so sad that I cannot really include all the applications that were developed by the companies because they all looked amazing. But yeah, you can see the maps there and you can see the red and the green signals, the pop-ups kind of, where you can see that the ring buoys are deployed. And if it is green, they are there in their place. And if it is red, then they are missing from their place. And all these kind of report would be given to the water safety officers. The same goes with the mobile application too. It would give the same amount of data. It's just more handy for people to carry around. And also the sensors, which are really small in size, if it's just the size of my palm, and it can fit into the ring buoy casing and can be used quite easily without being too much visible to the local public. Now, if we move to the next slide, we would see the procurement framework that we used, which was called as the PPI process, which is public procurement of the innovative solutions. And this was the very first time that this was implemented in Ireland, and I'm glad that I'm getting this opportunity to present it. But the general idea behind the procurement process that the public bodies use is very rigid in nature. So whenever the public bodies have to put out a contract in the outside environment, a tender process, they have to really specify that what kind of solutions they really want and what kind of solutions they are looking for. So it's usually targeted towards the existing technology. And that leaves very little room to deploy or to use the solutions that are very new to the cities, or to basically kind of the innovative solutions. It becomes very difficult for the public bodies to use those kind of solutions. And that's where the whole PPI process come into picture, because with this procurement process, it gives an opportunity to public bodies to be the early adopters or the launch customers for the solutions that are very new in the market. These are the solutions that are already there in the market, but may have a very small presence, or it could be an existing technology that can be used in a new, different, innovative way. Now, the small market presence is due to the inherent risk. It could be because of the inherent risk that the companies are afraid of putting it out in the market because they are not very aware of the customer base of it, or they are just not sure how much this product would be successful. And thus it gives companies a safe space to experiment their own solutions. And well, the local authorities get a idea, or get an opportunity to test these solutions, be the first customers. If we move on to the next slide, we would see the different stages of this procurement process. So there is a tender applications, then testing and deployment, and commercial scale up. This happens in two phases. First phase includes the tender application and the testing and deployment, and second is the commercial scale up. In the phase one, we select the vendors who come up with all the solutions that they have, and we select those vendors, maximum four local authorities, and then we ask them to test their solutions in real time on field. And then we move on to the evaluation phase, where we kind of discuss that discuss the reports, the output of the on-field testing that has been done so far, and come up with the final selection. Now, as I mentioned before, that this is a multi-supplier framework, so there could be all 4 companies going out for the final selection, and then these solutions will be available to all the local authorities that are there outside, and we can have kind of a mini competition, or the companies can just propose a solution to the local authorities, and the local authorities would be free to select any one of the companies. If we move on to the next slide, please. Just to highlight the process, that we are in the evaluation phase as of now, and we are in a process to finalize the companies to whom all these solutions would be available to. The solutions would be available in the market for the local authorities to use. And if we just move on to the next one, we would see that now for the scaling up of the process itself, we have the IP funding in place with the 10 local authorities, and this solution is going to scale up with Sligo as the lead application in the DIP funding. But yeah, if we move on to the next slide, we would see that all these 10 local authorities are now going to deploy the solution in their own areas. And I think this is going to be done in the starting of the next year. And I'm really happy to see the scaling of this innovation. The current on-field testing, the results out of it would feed into this scaling part, and the experience and the knowledge would be shared with these 10 local authorities to scale it in a better way, to see in a better way. But yeah, I think that is my last slide, and thank you so much, Yvonne. I know I went over time, really sorry. Over to you, Yvonne.
Great, thank you. Payal, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting and very, very good example of scaling in action, and how the projects that we do at a local level can actually extend far beyond the bounds of our own organizations and into the wider sector. So thank you very much for that. We're going to run on for about another 10 minutes or so and just cover a few questions and answers. If you have any questions, just a reminder to pop them into the chat box, and we will cover them if we can. And while we're doing that, we might just go back to the panel and cover off a few questions. Alan, I'm going to go to you first, and I'm particularly interested in the strong emphasis on stakeholder engagement in your project, and particularly because we see that as such a key theme that comes up in the innovation framework, in DEEPR's innovation framework. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. I suppose the first thing I want to ask you is this idea that scale doesn't just happen at the very, very end of a project, but it's something that's actually baked into the project from the very beginning, from the ideation phase, from the co-creation, and that seems to be something that comes across quite strongly for you. So the things I want to ask about stakeholder engagement, any tips for good stakeholder engagement, first of all, and any challenges in terms of divergent views, and how do you kind of navigate that?
Okay, thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, maybe on the whole co-design and scale and how they're intertwined. I think they're very much intertwined. A scale can mean different things to different people. So, as you know, on our broader Smart Dublin program, for us to scale would be a success factor for us to scale is when we go from innovation into BAU, even just within one council. That would be success. But everything you're hearing about today, we've actually scaled to more than a single council, where we're scaling into multiple local authorities, and we're scaling into multiple public sector bodies. You know, I think we've all talked about interaction with other public sector bodies. On the MASS project, is trying to scale or introduce innovation into the entire mobility sector in Ireland. So it's that the scope and the aspirations are significant. In terms of co-design and managing stakeholders along the way, I mean, it's kind of bread and butter stuff. It's working with people and defining the solution and proposition in a truly collaborative way with them, so they feel that they're co-designing the solution with you and that solution isn't being done to them. I think so many programs, so many big change programs suffer when the recipient of a solution feels that the solution is being imposed on them or is being done to them. So, I mean, our mantra at Smart Dublin, and for sure with MAS, because it's such a strategic opportunity, when we did our stakeholder map, it was significant, was vast. We had to talk to everybody. And again, just a point on MAS that's maybe different to some of our other projects. A lot of our other projects would be little small wonders or little use cases to trial something and just do it, might be the attitude. With MAS, there is a need to think, to come up with a strategy, a high level design before getting into piloting mode and so on, which is going to come. So a little bit different to some of our traditional projects, but the same sort of principle: collaborate, collaborate, collaborate right from the offset.
Okay, and I have a follow-up question on that, because you mentioned this kind of much wider ambition, which is obviously a key theme that we see as part of the deeper framework, to not just benefit our own organisation or direct benefit in terms of what we're doing, but the ambition really should extend to the wider public sector. And I suppose from a practical point of view, if you're running a project like that, I mean, what are the implications from the point of view of project management? You mentioned scope there, you mentioned stakeholder engagement. I suppose there's something there, considering that ambition as you start will also impact how you actually plan what you're going to do and give yourself enough resources, give yourself enough time. You might speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Just waiting for that live button to come through again. Yeah, okay, so when we started the journey, and if you remember the slide, I mean, it was back in 2019, we had the first conversations around MAS. Our deliverables, they weren't clear. And the first round of conversations, we were really tempted to let's just do an app, let's just get something up and running. But then just by talking to stakeholders and understanding how far the tentacles of MAS could go, we changed our tack. We changed our approach to say, okay, this has got to be a top-down approach, something far more fundamental. So our report, in a nutshell, is a thought leadership deliverable for Ireland. You can pick up a thought leadership document on MAS from the internet, and there's vast amounts of material out there on MAS, but we've developed something that's looking at international trends and looked at the local ecosystem and what Ireland needs. So our deliverable and our focus has matured over the last couple of years now to the report that we're about to publish.
That's great, thank you. Fantastic, and a kind of a follow-up related question to you, Pael. Why is it important for the Ring Boys project to have benefit for the wider sector? Why this kind of phase, kind of engaging everyone in this innovation procurement project, and what are the implications in terms of this project? I mean, is this something in terms of your exiting the project, continuing to be involved in it? I mean, how have you factored that into the project that you're working on?
Thank you for the question, Yvonne, and that's a very good question, actually. So when this topic of when this problem came up into the picture, the very initial thought in the 2019, we realized that this problem is a wider problem. If there is a ring boy anywhere in the city, there would be a problem of the missing ring boy. And not to make it better that we are living on an island, so we are surrounded by water. That means there are ring boys in every city that is there in the island. So we have to keep in mind that if we are facing this problem, there would be other cities, the other local authorities facing the same problem. And that's why I think from the very start, we planned it in a way that the solution can be scaled in a wider way. Now, I think the major implication when we see that, we are going to scale this further, it sounds very interesting, sounds very nice, but we forget to include the part that there is a huge number of stakeholders involved in that particular project. And that's where it becomes difficult, because stakeholder engagement and stakeholder management is kind of a bit difficult. If something is there in my house, I want to develop it in my house, I think it could be scalable. I would probably take input from my neighbor, but not from the whole building, because I would need the good different perspective, but sometimes too many cooks in the kitchen just spoils the food. So I think that's where the Rainbows project really made it through, because we had 4 different local authorities in the Dublin region, and each of the local authority had different perspectives. Some of them had the sea level seaside ring buoys, some had the riverside ring buoys, and that had kind of a different implication, different kind of results, different kind of sensors required. And I think that is very important, just to have stakeholders, at least the relevant one, that can give the different perspective involved from the initial point, and to define that what is required from them, if they are just there as the informed person, or will they be consulted, or basically creating kind of a racy metrics around them and keeping them informed. At least that would be the least, I think, that should be done, keeping the communication on with respect to the stakeholders.
Fantastic, Payal. Thank you very much, and that makes a lot of sense, and probably speaks a lot to what you were talking about as well, Barry, in terms of, I suppose, while we can want to avoid sometimes a wide range of opinions or divergent views on things, that actually that does help counter, it builds for a more robust outcome, it helps counter some of that bias that you were referring to in the production of your toolkit. I have one final question for you, Barry, and that relates to this idea of scale and stimulating scale and producing a toolkit and something that people can use and take and develop further. And I suppose it's around the kind of the challenge of developing a living, breathing document, something that I suppose innovation isn't just a single point in time, but it continues to evolve. And how do you do that? Like, what were your considerations in terms of putting the toolkit together?
Thanks very much, Vaughan. Yeah, huge consideration for us, specifically around the area of obsolescence, which when you think about tech and tourism, often you think about obsolescence. So for us, it was very much a build it and see kind of process. So we focused on developing the toolkit itself, and then next year when we actually go to build our own mobile app development project, we will be very much revising the whole toolkit as well, and looking at, well, what did we actually learn in the actual build it process, and how can that influence the next version of the toolkit, which we'll eventually publish as well. Okay, so it's something that continues to evolve. Absolutely, yeah, definitely. When it comes to tech and tourism, it has to constantly be evolving. Okay, fantastic. I have one final question that I think I'll put to you, Payal. It's from one of our watchers. Where can people find more information about the public procurement innovation? Is there a framework published somewhere?
Yeah, I was just about to put a link in there, but it is present online. It is, I mean, publicly present. If you just Google the PPI procurement, you'll get a number of links in there, and some of them are from the European Union themselves, with the European Commission. And it's actually being funded from the EAFIP, which is the European Application for Innovative Procurement. And I think I'll just put a link in there for the people just to go through it for all the resources.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm conscious of time and we are just about coming to the end here. So I suppose one of the main takeaways I think today is that there are a huge amount of resources available. The resources that Payal mentioned, Barry's toolkit, onto the Smart Dublin website, you'll find other case studies, interesting things to kind of get you thinking. And there's also obviously the Our Public Service website that has that innovation framework from Deeper, that has all of those really interesting resources and guides. So I would encourage you, as part of the kind of homework from today, to kind of continue to mull this over, to digest it, to reflect on it, and to share it. And I think that will be a success from today. So Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to our speakers, to Alan Murphy, Barry Rogers, Payal Pandya, and of course to Fingal for hosting us today, and to all of you for attending before your lunch break. So thank you all very much, and I wish you great success in all of your projects.
Thank you so much, Yvonne.
Thanks, Yvonne.